we'll give it a crack. So welcome to Patrick. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and to Nick from Melbourne. Obviously there's a lot going on everywhere in the world, and one of the things is about protecting your own markets or planning for future markets that you want to access. And so whilst survival, as I talked about earlier this morning, is critical, it's also about planning and understanding what is going on in global markets. So we've got two fantastic experts here to support that conversation today. Just want to also mention that Food SA has been awarded a grant through the federal government to establish the South Australian Food and Beverage Export Hub, which helps businesses fast-track their export planning and international sales through access to product and market-specific intelligence and consumer insights, support from experienced food and beverage advisors, and it saves time and money by supporting businesses to be confident in their export-related decisions. So that's all about the planning and understanding what markets want. So nested within Food South Australia, all participants will benefit from being part of the Food South Australia network of experienced business operators, which is a bit of a plug for our export hub, but it's really gearing up now, and we really are actively wanting to engage with industry on our hub. I would like Patrick, first of all, to introduce himself and outline what his role is. And Patrick's had many roles over the years with Austrade, so give us a quick snapshot, Patrick.
Quick snapshot, okay. We'll limit it to the last couple of years. So I've been back in Australia for about 6 years now, and was privileged enough to be the State Director here in South Australia. I also ran our state operations for Austrade for a while there. And now I'm working with a team of Austrade staff whose job it is to work with companies to help them expand internationally, and that's what Austrade, really, our primary cause or primary reason for being, is to help companies win business, sustain markets overseas.
Fantastic. And Nick, hi, how are you?
Good morning, from Melbourne.
Excellent. How about you give a quick intro of yourself as well, please?
Certainly. I'm the Director of the China practice at Asialink Business. And Asialink Business is the National Centre for Asia Capability and focuses on building practical Asia market-related skills through the delivery of best-in-class training programs, applied research, market insights focused on Australia's business engagement with Asia. I work within the China practice, which is really focusing on building those skills and knowledge to apply to navigating the complex, but also large growth opportunity that exists within the China market.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nick. So the way we're going to run this session is we're going to talk about 8 markets, and we've split it that Nick will talk about 4 and then Patrick will talk about 4. And we'll talk about some opportunities into the future as well. So Nick, maybe given China is your specific area of expertise, Nick is going to talk about China, Japan, South Korea and Vietnam. So kick off with China. Thanks, Nick.
Absolutely. So China's economy shrank by 6.8% during the first quarter of this year, which was, obviously an indication of how hard the economy was hit by COVID-19. Retail, tourism and hospitality sectors have been severely impacted, and supply chains and logistics, there was massive shocks to those systems. And considering that supply chains and logistics so integrated with the international economy, that's taken a really ripple effect onto many other nations as well. There are signs of recovery, which is predicted to be consumption-led and having a very heavy e-commerce component. So demand has been down across restaurant sales, which decreased dramatically in March and April by 31 and 48%. Retail sales have been down significantly by about 7% in April. And what we're seeing is a lot of that consumption has shifted out of necessity to online, and fresh food and food purchases online have increased 3%, with 40% of consumers increased frequency of buying online, and e-commerce grocery sales increasing sort of 26%. So we're seeing a real growth in that, and e-commerce is becoming more and more important as part of that channel mix for Chinese consumers. In terms of consumer behaviour, as well as many other countries throughout the world, there has been some behaviour shifts during this period, some of which are expected to sustain. and that is the greater focus on health and functional food benefits. Attitudes are changing. There's a reinforcement of the importance of health, fitness, and general well-being by Chinese consumers. And that is really translating into increases in fresh food, vitamins, supplements, and healthy food purchases during that period. This homebody economy, so home cooking, which we're seeing around the world as well, is also occurred in China, where people are buying fresh produce and ingredients to purchase to basically cook at home. Things like sauces, dairy, pasta, and the like. And we're seeing a lot more older generation Chinese purchasing online and purchasing fresh produce for the first time, as well as tier 3 onwards consumers also starting to increase their purchases online. So what we're seeing is more consumers purchasing food online and purchasing more often.
As we're going through these different countries, if anyone wants to put a question up, we'll answer it as we're going through the countries. So if there's anyone with a China question, feel free to pop it up now, and otherwise we'll move on to Japan.
Thanks, Catherine. So with Japan, we're seeing economic growth contract by 3.4% in Q1. There was the postponement of the Tokyo Olympics, which obviously has a large impact on the food service sector. And, out of the bankruptcies that have occurred due to COVID-19, a good proportion of those are linked to restaurant, hotels, tourism and food processing. So the sector has been hit. And restaurant sales have declined sharply as out of necessity consumers are purchasing goods from local convenience stores and supermarkets and cooking at home. And there was obviously a reduction in spend when it comes to in-restaurant dining and also takeaway as well. There was also sort of indications that wholesale seafood volumes decreased by sort of 22% year on year within Q1 through the Tokyo wholesale seafood market, indicating, a softening of demand, obviously due to logistics reasons as well. And there was some e-commerce growth in food spending and fresh food spending in a market where e-commerce spending and penetration of food spending is not very high. There has been some increase there as well. Some anecdotal indications from food exporters to Japan indicate that demand for dairy and products like butter and protein remains strong, as does fresh fruit and vegetable exports into the market as well, and with frozen beef and sheep meat exports also remaining strong during this period, and seafood exports being impacted by both food service demand implications, but also supply chain and air freight challenges as well. In terms of consumption changes, again, we're seeing the refocus on healthy lifestyles, on foods with immune and health benefits, the functional food benefits, and also the shift to ingredients that facilitate more home cooking. And what we're seeing is obviously that Australian products that we have to offer and that are already being exported into Japan have a lot of the elements that the Japanese consumers at this particular time are looking for. So we have a strong value proposition.
Thank you. Interesting. You're right about that e-commerce and online. It's changing behaviour everywhere, isn't it?
Absolutely.
South Korea.
So for South Korea, South Korea is a net importer of food. Its economy is expected to shrink by 1.2% in 2020. There has been large impacts into food service, and there are excess inventories, which obviously are going to soften demand for food imports. Retail sales are down, with bricks and mortar retail down about 7.5% year on year within Q1, and a lot of that spending has just transitioned to online, with a significant increase in online sales in February this year of 90%, which moderated to 11.8% in March, and that is across the food and beverage product spectrum. And what we're seeing in terms of indications from food exporters to South Korea are that, there are some areas where there are some weakening demand, but product categories, for example, like fruit and premium fruit have remained in terms of demand, driven by demand from smaller retail supermarkets and hypermarkets as well. In terms of consumption trends during this COVID period, food safety has been raised as a key issue and given more priority by South Korean consumers, and there's been an uptick in demand for organic and health-enhancing products. And they're the sort of areas as well. So a lot linked again to health and well-being. And we expect that whilst there's a peak during the COVID period due to the nature of the pandemic, that some of this consumption behaviour will also sustain into general consumer behaviour.
Nick, we've had a couple of questions come through about China, so we might just quickly jump back there if that's okay. The first question is, do you expect some reduction in trade with China due to the current trade tensions?
Look, at this stage, the indications are that for food and beverage categories that it's business as usual. I think all businesses need to keep an eye on what's going on in markets. They need to keep close to their customs brokers and to their channel partners to get any feedback if there are any issues. But at this stage, as far as indications that I'm aware of, that there have been no indications of any sort of issues with food exports going into China. I think there is robust consumer demand for imported product, and in terms of the demand that we're seeing for imported product across premium fresh produce, dairy, processed food, etc. Australia's the product offering from Australia and particularly from South Australia, we have a lot of very strong value propositions going into the market. So always keep close to developments and obviously referring to what's going on and information from Austrade as well. But at this stage, there's no indications of that.
Thanks for that. There's another question here. For China, what has been the demand in the premium end of the fresh fruit and veg market, and where Australia produce typically sits?
I think there has been a growing demand in premium food exports into China, and it's there's been, for example, if we're looking at the export of cherries, seasonal cherries into China. I know it's not a particularly South Australian produce, but those products are sold, and there's been a growth in. Sorry?
We do have cherries, and this has come from Susie Green, and she will definitely say we've got cherries.
Excuse me. So there's been a growth in premium fruit like cherries into the market, which is used not only for sort of family consumption, but also for gifting as well. And I think that those trends for products like cherries and other premium fruits will continue. And the demographics are in place. The upper middle class in China, in particular in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities, are looking for those premium produce, are looking for premium fruit products. And I think that that is an area of growth in the next sort of 3 to 5 years. I think there will be continued and sustained growth for premium fruit products.
Fantastic, thank you. We might now just quickly move to Vietnam. If you can give us an update on Vietnam.
Certainly. So Vietnam has been a strong economic growth market within Southeast Asia. Within 2019, growing at 7%. It's expected to decline to 4.8% in 2020. There are some good growth fundamentals there. Obviously, Vietnam-like economies throughout the world have been heavily impacted by COVID-19. The Vietnamese government have done quite a strong job of containing the pandemic. And obviously, there have been impacts onto the food sector, including food service, where demand has plunged due to lockdowns. Vietnam has a large and growing tourism sector, which obviously has been affected by lockdowns, and traditional retail of food has declined by 35% within sort of Q1 of 2020, and that shortfall has then switched again onto online, where we've seen around about a 30% increase in online shopping in the last couple of months, and platforms have been transitioning to basically support greater range of fresh and ambient food products being sold, and also traditional retail, bricks and mortar retail, are shifting business models so that they can work with organisations like the rideshare apps like Bee, Grab and GoViet to actually start getting fresh produce to consumers, and also delivery of restaurant food. In terms of demand, there's been indication, as same in South Korea, Japan and China, of the increase in home cooking through the increase of home cooking sort of appliances, but also ingredients, and more urban Vietnamese are looking to use Western ingredients in some of their home cooking activities as well. Dairy has increased, with infant formula sales increasing 14%, milk by 34%, and drinking yogurt by 36% in year-to-date terms. And a number of Vietnamese distributors have indicated that they've run out of popular dairy SKUs, things like sliced cheese and butter, indicating that there is still demand for, in particular, dairy products at this time.
Really interesting. Traditionally not dairy consumption in some of those markets, so there's a shift in all sorts of things. Thank you very much, Nick. Now, Patrick.
Catherine.
We're going to the UAE now.
Can we start with Malaysia?
Oh, we can if you like. That's out of order.
The reason being, I thought there was logic in following Nick down from North Asia through Southeast Asia, and then we might head over.
Patrick, off you go.
You're very kind. Thanks, Catherine. Look, I think Nick painted a picture where, in our view, the health response in markets is really a predetermination for the economic response. And if you look at the opening up of China as a signal, what we're seeing is, when we look down through North Asia and into Southeast Asia, it's how well the countries have been able to control the spread of the virus is the only real precursor as to how quickly they're opening back up. And I think that holds true, particularly when we get to Malaysia and then Singapore. So Malaysia really forced quite a strict lockdown quite early, before Australia did. They came out of it a couple of weeks ago. What they saw was similar to what we saw in Australia. There were holes on the shelves of retail, where there was issues in wholesale markets that were supplying into retail, that was causing a double whammy, if you like, that the modern retail wasn't able to get what they were trying to get for the consumers. Consumers themselves, their spend while they were in a really forced lockdown was down about 55%, but for food and beverage, which as we know is usually the case, the food and beverage consumption was up as people were forced home. So food and beverage consumption was up 27%, even though the overall consumption of the household was down. A socially compliant population, so there's been some significant relaxations for food service in particular, and the food service market was down 80%. There was only 20% of restaurants which were open, so a massive impact, and same in Singapore. That's now being lifted, and that's starting to come back. But the point about a socially compliant population, that'll take time. People are cautious. All of those points that Nick mentioned about the decisions they're making at retail, looking for fresh, looking for organic, really conscious about origin, provenance, really conscious about tamper-proof, who's handled the product, and that's going to have an implication for when the market opens up, and things like food sampling at a retail level. Online, of course, is increased in Malaysia as well. Singapore?
Yep.
Similar story, except Singapore is just going into phase 2 restrictions coming into place midnight tomorrow. So their food service sector is still shut down, starts to open up on whatever that is, Friday, effectively. What we're seeing from importers in Singapore is build-ups of seafood in particular, and any product that's got a strong focus into the food service sector. So oysters, live abalone, big build-up of stock in Singapore, and people are cautious about ordering for right now. That'll take a little while to move through the market, but the retail sector is strong. So the big retailers up there are still looking for product. They're interested to diversify their supply to make sure of the surety of supply, which of course is a challenge with the freight conditions that we have at the moment, particularly with air freight. The market in Singapore is going, it's a bit peaky, so we're hearing in the last week things like pork, for instance. There's a build-up of pork. That's in cross retail and food service, and I think the supply lines are part of that story. So people have got some stock on the ground, and it's taking a little bit of time for that product to move, and that, of course, is impacting suppliers in Australia. But the other thing about Singapore is the market diversification from a supply point of view is really important. So there's actually been an easing of restrictions in Singapore for some product, which is advantageous for Australia. So for the first time, our fresh and chilled frozen poultry has been allowed into Singapore. We've had some concessions given for red meat protein as well as eggs. So as the markets look to shore up its supply, some of those things have become temporarily more easy. Online.
And you say temporary, you think that it will revert?
Well, the Singaporean government has put a time frame on it.
Right, okay.
So they've said that while they do this, for the rest of this calendar year, they're happy for the exemptions to be in place, but it's not a permanent solution for them.
How do we turn that to an advantage for us?
I think it's about that surety of supply and being a trusted partner, which we have been, of course, through Southeast Asia for a very long time. And it's about making sure that that confidence is still there in everything that we do. The provenance, the way we produce, the scientific basis by which we send our products overseas and that we certify them is exactly what the Singaporean government has always wanted from Australia.
So if we do things really well, there might be those opportunities that get extended potentially.
Of course, yeah.
Good.
Across both Malaysia and Singapore, the online and the market platforms have taken a really big increase. So a poll in Malaysia a couple of weeks ago suggested that 93% of bricks and mortar retailers were going to do something, if they hadn't already, to bolster their online presence. And in Singapore, Lazada, which of course is an Alibaba-owned company, saw a fourfold increase in what was happening across Singapore from April. So those things are really becoming cemented operating principles and channels to the consumer. And
changes in behaviour that are potentially sustainable as well.
Absolutely.
Maybe not to the same extent, but certainly, I mean, online is everywhere, isn't it?
Absolutely. Which comes back to the question that was asked, I think, earlier in one of the immediate session about social media and the role of that. And I think that's a distinct opportunity that in Australia, the platforms have told us that we're not competitive to other countries in how we present our product, the suite of photographs, the video feeds, the live streams, how we consume our product. We have historically been more focused on talking to our customer, not the end consumer, and that's something that with this the trend being cemented, we really have to address.
How are we going to do that?
With hard work, I think, and with some creativity. So there's some investment required from companies to be able to present themselves the way that they want to a consumer and the way that the different markets want to consume that information. And I think right now is the time, if companies need to bolster their social media marketing, right now is the time to start to think about doing that, because I think that change has really become cemented.
Let's not miss an opportunity.
Indeed.
Can we now go to the UAE?
Let's, Catherine. That makes sense. Good idea. The UAE is, the Gulf states actually, and the UAE in particular, if we think about the health implications of COVID, are really in a difficult spot right now. And we're seeing that in how they're responding. So across the Emirates themselves, some of the social shifts which were thought of are starting to come to bear more quickly than perhaps people thought. So oil revenue is down, tourism is down, Dubai Expo, so the World Expo has been shifted 12 months. Expatriates are moving to other employment opportunities in the Gulf states or going home. All of that is impacting on the economics of the Emirates, but also across the Gulf states. Their infection rate is still high. The food service sector is struggling. The premium end of the market is struggling as a result of food service struggling. Retail is doing okay, as you would expect. There's an increase in organic, in biodynamic, 155% year on year up as a result of COVID, and the consumers looking for that kind of surety of product, as well as across fresh fruit and vegetables and some of the commodity products, so 55% up year on year. But that economic impact in the Middle East has still got a way to run across the Gulf states and in the Emirates. And we're seeing other problematic trends emerging across the Gulf states. If you look at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for instance, they've tripled their VAT as a way to be able to shore up some of their revenue streams. They're starting to apply some duties and tariff rates on products, again, as a surety of revenue stream, but also to try and promote greater self-sufficiency in the region. And that trend has been there for a while, but it's really starting to get some traction given what's going on at the moment. And coming back to global supply chains, some of those surety issues, where can you get food if you don't have the body of airplanes that we're used to before this pandemic operating? So those type of shifts in the Middle East are starting to really bite us. And I think that's going to play out for the next couple of months. That's not done yet.
Dynamic. Now, it's probably appropriate to leave the US to last.
Sure.
Give us an update on that.
Because the US is an interesting one. The US is still in the middle of a health crisis, but is opening up its states. And I'm not a health expert, it's not for me to say they're in the middle of a health crisis, but if you compare what we've done in Australia and how we've all become conscious of looking at the health curve in the US is still going up. It's not yet flattened. So what has happened in the retail market in the US is really similar to what's happened in Australia. There was massive logistical challenges, holes on shelves, as the country basically went through 1% increase from the end of February to the first day of March, to then a 10% increase in sales to 103% increase in 3 days, what we saw in Australia. Moving through the pantry, the cleaning goods into fresh. That has kind of worked through. The retailers have responded across the hurricane belt in particular. They're more used to it really well. They've been able to smooth that supply. And in other parts of the country, it's still a bit patchy. One thing that the retailers have said in the US is surety of supply is now an absolute critical conversation that they're going to have for everybody that they range and how they want to range into the future. So that just-in-time kind of supply that we've all become a bit used to, the terminology is starting to be just in case. So how can we have the stocking levels that are needed to make sure that people have got a bit more comfort if something were to happen, this type of supply shock happens again. Food service in the US is still really struggling. Probably similar to what we've seen in Australia, at least in how the companies pivoted to be able to keep themselves afloat. Food service in the US has really pivoted to retail. So some of the food service channels which weren't competing with the retail aspect are now supplying into retail. So the competition has increased, the logistics are difficult, and the market has embraced freedom and liberty like America is wont to do, and they are actively out there doing it differently to anywhere else in the world.
Ain't that the truth? Oh dear, interesting times for everything. So maybe throwing to both you, Nick, and to Patrick, what do you see as the opportunities and how can our industry best capitalise on them? So maybe, Nick, I'll throw to you first.
I think, moving into a post-COVID environment, there are a number of sort of underlying factors. Obviously, there's going to be an economic recovery period, and that's going to impact on food exports in different ways. And there are going to be obviously some categories affected more than others. But if we're looking at underlying consumer behaviour in some markets, and using China as an example, there is a increased demand for food quality due to a general lower or weak trust in domestically produced products. The rising health awareness is going to drive demand for quality, premium, imported products. And we've got that also translates across to Japan and South Korea as well. And diversification of diets due to sort of emerging consumer classes, which are some of the prevalent drivers in Vietnam and China, are going to see greater demand across the board, across the suite of, or the range of different export products, from protein to processed foods to fresh fruit and vegetables into some of these markets. And of course, dairy being a common denominator in China, Vietnam and South Korea, where there is a strong growth trajectory in those sectors. So look, I think just there are a number of underlying factors which I hope will sort of maintain demand for a lot of exported premium food products from Australia. That are common to a number of markets. And they're just a few initial thoughts, Catherine.
Great. What about you, Patrick?
So I think the provenance that we have in Australia and the ability to, the brand that we have, good product, well grown, scientifically attested, safe as houses, if you like, the clean and green, and the science behind it. That's going to hold us in good stead. I think the challenge is going to be how we respond to how consumers are going to make decisions. That and the supply line. So the prevalence of the market platforms, the Alibabas, the Lazadas, and repeat in whichever market you choose, the Amazons, how consumers are making decisions. So if we think of the spike in e-commerce and social media marketing that followed SARS, this has accelerated in between SARS and COVID, and I think has now become absolutely cemented, and people's behaviour has changed. So how we present our companies and our products to a consumer is, I think, fundamentally going to change as a result of this. Even in a market like the Middle East, where in the Emirates before COVID there was only 5% of the population was doing anything from a food and grocery online, it's now 55%. No one would have thought of that in February, but those type of things are happening. So I think from a product point of view, we're okay. How we present to the market, we're going to have to respond. And I think there's a question about, is there a new normal when it comes to surety of supply and being able to get our product into market? Some of the forecasts suggest that it's going to be 4 years before we have pre-COVID level movement of aircraft. Now that's a fundamental game changer for price points into markets and how we actively get our products that are highly perishable and highly valuable into some of our key markets. It may be 12 months, but it's not going to be this calendar year.
Yeah.
So how do we position ourselves to be able to respond to that? And then the other thing I think is really important until we get free movement of people again is how we engage with our customers. So not just the end consumer of our product through social media, but how do we engage with our customers? How do we, that research question that was asked of Nick earlier, how do we conduct research when we're not able to travel into the market? How do we get those networks working for us so that we can make the right decisions?
I think there's a lot of opportunity with market intelligence data, collaboration, and really having that one team approach with all the providers to support the industry. Because I think if we look at things being as the collaboration element to that and the sharing of information and that sort of thing, that's surely going to put us in a better stead than we otherwise might be.
Absolutely.
Just one quick one. What about the e-commerce platform for grocery products in the Middle East?
And I wish I knew the answer to that question, but
sorry, Patrick, I shouldn't have asked.
That's okay. You could always ask. I'll have a chat to our guys in market, and I'll come back to Catherine with that answer.
Thank you. And what about final question, if exporters were to focus marketing spend in one market, and I'll ask both of you this, which would you recommend? Where are you going to get greatest bang for buck from your marketing spend? Who's the most receptive to our message?
There's not an answer to that. Oh. Look, I think if you're being...
That's a good answer, I think.
There's two answers. If you're being opportunistic, like we all have to be, China is probably the spot right now that is opening up the quickest, and it's been proven that they've been able to contain the spread of COVID, and they are releasing their economy more quickly than any other. But I think the real answer to the question is, where is your important customer? Because the retention of your customer is crucial. And being sympathetic to that customer and building a response with that customer, wherever that customer is, wherever your number one customer is, or even your number one growing customer, that's the market that you need to double down in, because that loyalty and that retention of the market is going to be critical.
Fantastic. Nick, did you have anything else to add to that?
I think that was a really good answer.
I thought it was too.
I think developing any new market takes, as everyone's fully aware, look, it takes a significant amount of time and investment, and I think there is no quick fix. I think all of the markets that I touched on offer different types of growth opportunities, have very different channels to market, have very different e-commerce and bricks and mortar retail environments, and have very, very different, target segments. So I think, and all of them, do have green shoots in terms of where there are growth opportunities. So I think, investing heavily into whichever market, or appropriately into whichever market, plus adding to what Patrick just mentioned, would be the only other thing I'd add to that. But there are growth opportunities within the region for sure.
Fantastic. Thank you both. There's a closing slide that's going to come up on the screen apparently about where you can go for further assistance. So there'll be some information on Asialink Business, Austrade, and of course the South Australian Food and Beverage Export Hub. We look forward to hearing from you into the future, and I think that was a whirlwind of 8 markets, but incredibly informative from both of you. So from my perspective, thank you both very much for participating in this morning's Global Updates.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Patrick. Applause, please. Suitable applause. Thank you.